There are things in life you can't explain to anyone unless they've walked the road you've walked. The silence after loss. The echo of someone's laugh still bouncing around your home long after they're gone. That lake hidden just beyond the tree line behind my house was the only place that ever made sense after my wife Allison passed. We moved out here in 1998, back when the area was still mostly open land and gravel roads. The lake wasn't a showpiece back then. It wasn't manicured or stocked or patrolled by bored HOA enforcers with clipboards. It was quiet, wild, unbothered, just like her. Allison loved that lake more than anything. She used to say the water looked like it held its breath at sunset, like it was listening. When cancer took her, I didn't know where to go. We had been married for 27 years. I was a Navy veteran, a father to grown kids who had moved away, a retired engineer. But without her, all those titles felt hollow. So I built a bench, right there by the lake under the same dogwood tree we used to picnic beneath. Every morning for 6 years straight, I sat on that bench with a cup of black coffee and spoke to her out loud. I didn't care if anyone thought I was crazy. That lake held her voice. The neighborhood changed around me after she died. Development crept in like ivy, quiet at first, then strangling. The farmland was bought up. Houses with plastic shutters and imported stone facades popped up like mushrooms. Young families, software people, retirees with fancy Teslas, and no sense of community. Then came the HOA. They called themselves the Lakeside Preservation Committee. Sounded harmless enough. Their letters were courteous at first, just reminders to maintain visual consistency and maximize neighborhood value. I laughed the first time I got one, told them my grass grew on my terms, and that they could stuff their form letter threats in the trash. I had lived here longer than they'd known the zip code. Still, I played nice, for a while. I attended a couple meetings. I brought banana bread once. I even helped fix a neighbor's dock after a windstorm. But I knew the moment they appointed Karen Schultz as HOA president, the tide was turning. Karen was the kind of person who smelled weakness like a bloodhound. She didn't knock on doors, she issued notices. Her yard was an award-winning diorama of overcommitment with solar lights, timed to the second, and tulips planted in color-coded rows. The woman once fined a neighbor for a patriotic flagpole angle violation. You'd think someone like that would at least respect boundaries. But Karen didn't believe in boundaries. She believed in bylaws. And somewhere in that twisted mind of hers, she decided the lake behind my house, the one I had loved and maintained for over 2 decades, belonged to her HOA. I found out the way people like me always do. Not with a knock, not with a phone call, but with a sign. Future site of Lakeside Splash Zone, a community enhancement project sponsored by LPC HOA. The sign was staked into the ground just 10 feet from my dock. I remember standing there, the morning sun burning through the mist, trying to process the words. My stomach dropped. I looked back toward the house, half expecting to see Allison at the window fuming. But it was just me now. I ripped the sign out of the ground and marched down the path toward the main road, where I spotted 2 men in neon vests, unloading PVC pipes and plastic fencing from a flatbed truck. One of them waved lazily at me. The other kept working. I walked right up and asked them what the hell they were doing. HOA said this section's going to be a shallow basin for the splash zone. We're trenching a pipe toward the east bank next week. This is my land, I said. They looked confused. Aren't you in Lakeside Preserve? No. This house predates the HOA by 11 years. The lake is mine. I pay taxes on it. I have the deed. They shrugged, indifferent. You'll have to talk to management. We're just contractors. And that's when I saw her Karen standing near the new playground installation with a rolled-up blueprint in her hand and that same patronizing smirk she always wore like lipstick. I marched toward her, heart pounding like a war drum. She greeted me as if we were friends. Oh, Hank. I meant to stop by earlier this week. Isn't it exciting? The community really needs more family-focused spaces. I nearly choked. That lake doesn't belong to you, Karen. It's private land. You've got no right to build anything there. She pursed her lips and tilted her head. Actually, our legal team found a clause suggesting easement rights were never formally revoked during the previous plat development. And with the majority HOA vote, cut the crap, I snapped. I have a survey, a deed, and 2 decades of maintenance records. That shoreline, that dock, that water, it's mine. Her voice dropped just a little. Hank, no one wants to fight you, but the community is growing. People want access to the water. And frankly, you're one man. You can't gatekeep nature. I'm not gatekeeping nature, I said, stepping closer. I'm defending what's mine. She blinked slowly, and for the first time, I saw something flicker behind her eyes. Not fear. No, Karen didn't fear people like me. But annoyance. The kind of annoyance bullies feel when their favorite punching bag talks back. That night, I went into the attic and opened the old metal box where Allison had kept all our legal paperwork. Inside was the original survey map from 1998, the handwritten water rights agreement from the previous landowner, and the notarized documents from the county clerk's office. The lake was mine. Legally. Permanently. And Karen had just made a terrible mistake. I sat by the window that night watching the moonlight ripple across the lake's surface. Allison would have smiled, because she knew something Karen didn't. I didn't just own the lake. I also owned the floodgate, and I remembered how to use it. The next morning, I woke up to the shrill beeping of a backhoe reversing somewhere near the eastern edge of my property. I didn't even bother with coffee. I threw on my boots, grabbed my phone, and stepped out the back door with the kind of sinking feeling that makes your heart beat in your throat. And sure enough, just beyond the dock where Allison and I used to fish in silence, there were fresh tire tracks cutting through the wet soil like scars. Karen had moved quickly, too quickly. Overnight, she'd sent in a landscaping crew to install plastic orange fencing along what used to be my tree line, enclosing not just the public trail a few yards off the road, but a full 20 feet into my backyard. My dock was now on their side of the fence. The stone bench I built with my own hands under Allison's dogwood tree stood like a hostage within a cheap plastic cage labeled Construction Area, Do Not Enter. It was surreal, like someone had photoshopped my life into a corporate brochure without asking permission. I didn't see the crew at first, just the hum of machinery in the distance. But then, I spotted two HOA volunteers wearing matching reflective vests, clipboards in hand, chatting by the new signage. One of them was Martha Klein, a real estate agent, who'd only moved in 3 years ago and was now acting like she'd built the whole neighborhood with her bare hands. The other was James, something always wore loafers without socks, and thought he was too important to pick up after his dog. I walked up to them calm but seething. Who authorized this? Martha turned like she was on stage. Oh, Hank, you should have gotten the email last night. It's part of the Lakeside Access Beautification Project. We're optimizing community shoreline access for all homeowners. On my land, I snapped. James chimed in. Karen said this area was part of the original easement zone. It's in the new revised plot plan. And since the HOA holds collective voting authority, stop, I cut him off. You don't have authority on property you don't own. You can't just draw new lines on a map and pretend they're legal. Martha gave me a pitying look. Hank, this is about progress. You've had exclusive use of the lakefront for decades. Isn't it time to share? I stared at her. You mean surrender? And no, it's not. They walked off without another word. By noon, Karen had shown up in her crisp, seafoam green pantsuit and matching visor, barking orders like a general inspecting a parade. She waved to a couple walking their toddler and beamed with pride at the new banner stretched between two metal posts, coming soon. Lakeside Splash Zone, grand opening, July 4th. It felt like a slap. I tried reason. I walked up to her, no threats, no shouting. Just an old man holding his deed and trying to remind a woman drunk on power that laws still existed. She didn't even look at the papers. I'm sorry, Hank, she said, folding her arms. The community voted. The improvements are already funded. If you have a grievance, you're welcome to submit it through the HOA's mediation form. Mediation form. I laughed bitterly. This isn't a noise complaint, Karen. This is trespassing. Land theft. You built a fence across my property line, and now you're advertising a public splash park on my lake. Karen adjusted her sunglasses like she was brushing me off with the flick of a wrist. You're being dramatic, and frankly, if you continue interfering with construction, we may have to cite you under the Community Disruption Clause. That was when something inside me shifted. Not broke, but hardened. Because I saw it in her face, she thought I was bluffing. That I'd just grumble and retreat into my house with my memories and coffee and old stories no one cared about. She thought I was already half gone. But I wasn't done, not yet. That evening, I went to the county clerk's office and requested a certified copy of the original deed. Then I visited the engineering department and requested the site plans from 1998, the ones Allison and I had signed when we first purchased the land. Sure enough, in the notes clear as day was the hand-sketched shoreline boundary, and in the margin in blue ink from the prior owner, a note. Includes all littoral rights and access to southeast drainage infrastructure. That drainage infrastructure. It was a manually operated sluice gate, hidden under a camouflaged utility box near the old fishing path behind the dogwood trees. I'd inspected it every spring, kept it free of debris, made sure the locking pin wasn't rusted through. Karen didn't know about it, and that meant one thing: she didn't control the water level. I did. But I wasn't going to act rashly, not yet. I wanted documentation. I wanted proof of every inch they were stealing. I needed witnesses, timestamps, photographs, records, because the kind of revenge I had in mind wasn't loud or messy. It was strategic, precise, and legal. So I waited. Over the next few days, things escalated. The plastic fencing was replaced with permanent posts. They poured concrete footers without permits. I heard them hammering in the early mornings. They even installed security cameras facing my house. Then came the flyer. It showed up in every mailbox in the neighborhood, printed in full color with cheerful fonts and pastel illustrations of happy families playing on inflatable slides. Lakeside Splash Zone. Opening soon, fun in the sun for residents of all ages, located behind the Prescott residence, now a shared community shoreline experience. They'd used my name, without permission. That night, I sat on the bench under the dogwood and ran my fingers along the grain. Allison's initials were still faintly carved into the side. I could hear her voice, soft and amused. "Don't let them push you around, Hank. You're smarter than that." I whispered back, "I know." And in that moment, I made my decision. No more warnings. No more conversations. If Karen wanted to play this game, she'd find out I wrote the rulebook. By the end of the week, the noise didn't stop. It became a part of the air itself. Generators humming at dawn. Excavators grinding their teeth into the soft shoreline. The chirp of walkie-talkies. Even the birds seemed to have given up and flown to quieter trees. My lake, Allison's lake, was now a construction zone. They'd started laying out thick coils of blue piping along the bank, forming the skeleton of what would eventually become the infamous splash zone. Truckloads of sandbags were being hauled in, and crews in reflective vests began anchoring shallow platforms meant to float just a few feet from the shore. On the HOA website, there was now a whole page dedicated to the project, complete with drone footage taken over my property without so much as a courtesy call. And still no permits. I checked with the city's building office in person. I handed over the HOA's promotional flyer and a photo I'd taken of the rebar sticking up like rusted bones near my dock. The clerk looked puzzled, tapped a few keys on her terminal, then frowned. "There's no active permit request for a recreational water facility at that address," she said. "Can I get that in writing?" "Sure." I walked out of that office with the city's official stamp on a document that would eventually crack the entire facade Karen had built. But it wasn't enough yet. I needed the right moment, the right blow. Back at home, the view from my kitchen window, once filled with rippling blue water and low-hanging branches, was now obstructed by a metal scaffolding and a row of fluorescent traffic cones. Kids from the HOA board's families had already begun to wander onto the worksite after school hours, skipping between trenches and shouting across my yard like it was their private summer camp. I called out once politely, "Hey, that's private property. You can't be back there." One of them rolled his eyes and said Karen said it's fine. She said you're just mad 'cause you're old. I smiled, but not kindly. "Tell Karen I said the lake's about to get real shallow real fast." The boy blinked, unsure if I was joking. The next day, I found an official envelope taped to my door. It was from the HOA, of course. Inside was a formal letter that looked like it had been written by someone who watched too many courtroom dramas. "Dear Mr. Prescott, in light of your continued verbal confrontations with community members and your refusal to cooperate with the Lakeside Enhancement Initiative, the HOA Board has voted to issue a series of escalating fines for obstruction of communal progress. Effective immediately, a $250 fine will be issued for each day that you fail to comply with the Community Shoreline Access Resolution ratified on April 2nd. Furthermore, your property has been flagged for non-compliance with landscaping standards including overgrowth near utility areas and absence of approved fencing around open water access. Sincerely, Karen Schultz, HOA President, Lakeside Preserve. I laughed out loud. Open water access, I owned the water. And the so-called resolution, it had no legal authority over deeded non-HOA property. I didn't sign into their little dictatorship when they formed. My land wasn't under their covenant, their jurisdiction, or their imaginary communal progress umbrella. But they didn't care. Karen had convinced her little army of clipboard carriers that I was a bitter relic, standing in the way of family fun. But she underestimated one thing. While she was hosting bake sales to fund her water park, I was scanning old land surveys and speaking to environmental consultants. The floodgate system wasn't just decorative. It was active and legally permitted. Installed back in 1976, when the original property owner dammed the north bend of the lake to create an artificial basin, the gate regulated outflow into a secondary channel that passed through a protected wetland zone. It had been decommissioned briefly in the 90s, then restored by me and Allison when we bought the land. I had inspection photos, maintenance logs. The hydraulic lever still worked like new, and the moment water levels reached a certain point, I could drain the entire basin in under 12 hours. But timing mattered. If I did it too soon, Karen would twist the narrative, claim sabotage, demand legal action. I had to wait until she crossed a line that even her HOA couldn't defend. It didn't take long. That weekend, I returned from the farmer's market to find 4 strangers standing inside my fenced-in garden, laughing, as they sipped iced lattes and pointed at the view like it was a real estate listing. I stormed over, already knowing what was coming. They were potential investors. One of them introduced himself as Kyle. We're considering helping fund the second phase of the splash zone. There's talk of paddle boats, maybe even a snack bar on the South Dock. Karen says she's negotiating use rights with the county. My mouth dried. Karen doesn't own the dock or the lake. She's building illegally. He chuckled and patted me on the shoulder like I was some harmless antique. Well, she's got vision. I'll give her that. That was it. The next day, I filed an official cease and desist with the county clerk's office, attaching the deed, the property lines, and photographic evidence of trespassing. I included a notarized statement from the original land surveyor still alive at 78, confirming that the HOA had no rightful claim to the water body. But I didn't deliver it to Karen. Not yet. Instead, I walked to the floodgate box, opened the rust-proof latch, and ran a systems check. Everything was operational. Pressure levels were steady. The outflow channel was clear. I slid the wrench into the valve slot just to feel the weight of it in my hand. That smooth click was like the cocking of a revolver in an old Western. Not today, I thought, but soon. And when I did it, it would be clean, legal, unstoppable. Karen had no idea she was standing on a water park built over sand, and I was about to pull the plug. The next HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a glorified conference room they'd retrofitted with folding chairs, a screen projector, and those little cookie trays that never quite lost the taste of plastic wrap. I hadn't attended one in over a year. The last time I tried, Karen spoke over me so many times, I nearly walked out mid-sentence. But this time I was prepared. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the front row, deed folder in hand, pressed and highlighted like a court exhibit. The room slowly filled with familiar faces, neighbors I'd known since before the first cul-de-sac, was paved newer ones who only ever waved with 2 fingers from their golf carts. They whispered when I walked in. A few nodded respectfully. Some avoided eye contact. Most of them I knew had no idea what was actually happening. They believed what Karen told them. They always had. At 6:00 p.m. sharp, Karen entered through the side door in her usual pastel blouse and pin-straight posture, carrying a leather portfolio and flanked by her inner circle, James, Martha, and a new woman named Cheryl who looked like she ironed her hair. Karen tapped the microphone. Good evening, neighbors. Thank you for joining us at this month's Lakeside Preservation Committee meeting. Tonight, we'll be updating you on our beloved Splash Zone project. So many exciting developments. I raised my hand before she could continue. Her eyes flicked toward me like a cat spotting a spider. Mr. Prescott, she said coolly, please hold your comments until the open forum section. I have a legal document that disputes the entire basis of your project. That shut her up. The room hushed. Even James shifted in his seat. Karen forced a smile. You'll have your time to speak. I stood. Everyone in this room deserves to hear it before you spin another fantasy about lakeside paddle boats and snack bars. I opened the folder and held up the deed. This is the original land deed from 1998, certified and recorded by the county. It shows that I own the lake. Not the HOA, not this committee, not some vague community trust. Me. Every inch of shoreline behind my property. Every gallon of water. Every drainage valve. I have maintained it for over 2 decades, paid taxes on it, cleaned it, restored it after every storm. Karen took a step forward. With all due respect, Hank, don't you respect me now, Karen? You've ignored this deed once, fined me, built over my property, held events on my land without so much as a phone call, and now you're raising HOA dues to fund a water park that sits on private property you don't own. That's fraud, someone in the back murmured. A couple leaned into each other, confused. A man asked, "Wait, is that true?" Karen laughed nervously. Let's not get carried away with accusations. The HOA Legal Subcommittee has reviewed relevant easements and there are no easements, I snapped. They expired when the original developer dissolved the property trust in 2002. That lake was deeded to me in full. And just in case anyone wants proof, I've brought copies for each of you. I walked down the center aisle, placing packets on chairs, hands trembling with focus. I had spent 3 weeks preparing these. Highlighted sections, tax records, satellite photos with lines traced in red ink. Even a sworn affidavit from the original developer who had retired to Florida and kindly agreed to send a notarized statement affirming I had exclusive rights to the lake. Karen was seething now, her nostrils flaring beneath her forced smile. This is not the appropriate forum to... James raised a hand. Karen, if this is true, we may need to pause construction. What she hissed. Martha added, it's not just about the lake, if we've trespassed. Karen slammed her portfolio shut. You're all missing the bigger picture. This project benefits everyone. Hank is just... He's a lonely old man clinging to his backyard like it's sacred land. I turned to face her fully. It is sacred. That lake is where my wife's ashes were scattered, where my kids learned to swim, where I've grieved in peace for years, and you desecrated it with concrete neon signs and cheap plastic slides. For what? So you could put your name on another community newsletter. That landed like a thunderclap. The room went dead silent. Karen's expression finally cracked just for a moment. Her hands clenched. Her voice dropped into something darker. You can't stop progress, Hank. This neighborhood belongs to all of us. The HOA was voted into power. I met her gaze. But your power ends where my deed begins. I left before the meeting adjourned. I didn't need to hear the excuses or the spin. By the time I got home, I already had 2 emails from neighbors apologizing for supporting the splash zone. One even offered to start a petition to halt further construction. Another neighbor, a quiet Vietnam vet named Raul, who lived 2 houses down, walked over just after sunset with a cooler of beer and said, "Didn't know they were lying. I got your back, hermano." Still, the next morning, construction continued. Karen was doubling down. A new email came from the HOA board. It claimed the documents I'd distributed were inaccurate and misleading, that the board's legal counsel had determined the lake to be functionally communal, and that my interference with construction would be met with consequences. Then came the kicker. They issued a new fine, $1,000, for obstruction of HOA-sanctioned community improvements, and this time, they filed a lien notice with the county recorder's office. I'd had enough. They had crossed from nuisance to full-blown abuse of power. And if Karen wanted a war, she just got one. That afternoon, I drove to the Environmental Compliance Division and filed a formal complaint about unpermitted construction near protected wetlands. Then I mailed copies of the HOA's false lien attempt to my lawyer. And that night, I opened the floodgate box, tested the crank, marked the forecast. Rain was coming, just enough to raise the waterline, just enough to make the draining feel necessary. I sat on the bench beneath the dogwood and whispered to Allison, "Tomorrow, love. Tomorrow we drain the lies." The morning rain came soft and steady, more mist than downpour, but it was enough. I watched it bead on the lake's surface like 1,000 little needles stitching the water into glass. The air was heavy, hushed. It reminded me of the hours before deployment, when silence meant something was about to break loose. And something was. The HOA newsletter hit inboxes at 7:04 a.m. sharp. Subject line, Urgent Community Alert. Lake Dispute Escalates. Inside was a smear job with my name plastered across the top like a wanted poster. As some of you are aware, Mr. Hank Prescott has recently distributed false property claims in an attempt to delay the Lakeside Splash Zone project. The HOA's legal advisors have thoroughly reviewed the situation and determined the lake to be a shared feature of the neighborhood. Mr. Prescott's claims are not only inaccurate, but harmful to community morale. Effective immediately, a $1,000 fine has been issued. Further disruptions will result in litigation. We ask all residents to remain calm and allow progress to continue. I read the email 3 times. They hadn't just dismissed my deed, they'd branded me a liar. Publicly. Boldly. And worse, they had framed it as a civic duty to ignore me. To alienate me. It worked faster than I expected. That same day, my neighbor across the street, a woman named Julie, who'd once brought me soup after my surgery, turned away when I waved. Her husband avoided eye contact while mowing the lawn. 2 teenagers walking past my driveway snickered behind their phones. The betrayal cut deeper than the fine. I wasn't just dealing with Karen anymore. I was fighting a narrative. But that was the thing about being underestimated. It gave you space to prepare in silence. I spent that afternoon filing 3 separate complaints. One to the county zoning department citing unpermitted recreational construction on residential land. 2. One to the state environmental agency reporting disruption of wetlands through unnatural water redirection. 3. And one to the utility oversight board highlighting potential liability due to electrical systems being installed near unapproved water features. I attached every photo, every time-stamped document, every witness statement I had collected. By 3:00 p.m., my inbox pinged with confirmation receipts. The paper trail was growing longer than Karen's lies. But the HOA didn't flinch. Instead, they escalated. At exactly 4:17 p.m., a code enforcement officer showed up at my door with a clipboard and a forced smile. Mr. Prescott, we received an anonymous complaint about unsafe conditions on your property, overgrown vegetation, unprotected shoreline, and what appears to be an unsecured drainage fixture near the southeast corner. I stared at him. You mean the one the HOA just built on top of my land? He didn't respond, just scribbled something on his form. I asked for a badge. He showed it barely. I asked who filed the complaint. Can't disclose that, he said, flipping another page. But we've been instructed to assess fines if conditions aren't addressed within 72 hours. He left a bright orange notice of violation stuck to my mailbox like a trophy. It was surreal. They were hitting me from all angles, now legal threats, public shame code, enforcement. And still, the water park rose like some gaudy monument to arrogance. They'd even started drilling in portable fountains and installing motion sensors along the dock. Children wandered freely through the fenced zone. Teenagers blasted music as they tested the inflatable slides tethered to my trees. I had had enough. That night, under a cover of fog and the hum of distant generators, I opened the floodgate fully for the first time in 10 years. It was slow at first. A hiss, then a trickle, then a deep-throated gurgle as the valve came alive and decades of pressure pushed forward like an exhale from the earth itself. The water rushed through the underground spillway I'd maintained faithfully every spring, snaking toward the wetland release basin nearly half a mile away. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. But by morning, the lake had dropped a full 6 inches. The edges of the dock stood dry and exposed. The new concrete pads tilted awkwardly in the shifting mud. One of the floating platforms had beached itself on a patch of jagged rocks. Karen showed up at 7:48 a.m. in yoga pants and a visor, holding a phone in one hand and pointing at the shoreline with the other. "They've sabotaged it," she shouted to a small crowd. "Someone is draining the lake." I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee and watched the chaos unfold. James arrived in a golf cart and examined the trench. He paced nervously. 2 of the workers from the splash zone team showed up next, arguing about pump strength and water tables. Karen pulled her phone out and made a call. I didn't need to hear it to know who she was dialing the sheriff. Sure enough, at 9:15 a.m., a deputy arrived. I stayed calm. Let them come. I walked out to greet him and handed over the original deed, the environmental report, the engineer's diagrams showing the floodgate mechanism, and the legal paperwork confirming my right to manage water levels. He skimmed through the pages, looked at Karen, then back at me. "You're within your rights," he said quietly. "No law against draining your own lake, especially not with that much documentation." Karen turned a shade of red I'd only ever seen on gas canisters. But this affects the community," she shrieked. "He's endangering public property." The deputy raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, public property requires a legal claim. And from what I can see here, you're building on someone else's land." "But the vote," she cried. "The board approved. That's an internal matter, not a legal one." She fell silent. And the deputy added, "If you'd like to contest the deed, ma'am, you're welcome to take it up with a judge. But I'd suggest you halt construction in the meantime. I'll be filing a report." It was done. Her empire, propped up by lies and plastic tubing, had just sprung a leak she couldn't patch. And I wasn't finished. That night, I sent the same documentation to every single HOA member. I printed physical copies and slid them into mailboxes wrapped in blue folders labeled "What Karen Didn't Tell You." By morning, my inbox was overflowing with apologies, stunned reactions, and neighbors asking for coffee. One message from Martha stood out. "Hank, I didn't know the whole story. I'm so sorry. Please let me know how I can help undo this mess." It was starting to crack. Karen had no water, no permits, no legal claim. All she had left was panic. It rained hard that night. Not the gentle drizzle of days past, but a real storm, thunder, slanted sheets of rain, and a sky that refused to sit still. The kind of storm that made the gutters overflow and the windows hum. But while most of the neighborhood hunkered down indoors, I sat by the lake, rain soaking through my flannel, as I watched the water rise, inch by patient inch. I knew what was coming. Nature had handed me the perfect excuse. Karen didn't realize it yet, but the very flood she feared gave me full justification to open the gate wider. The storm wasn't just rain, it was legal cover. By 2:00 a.m., the lake had crested just above its typical high mark. Not dangerously so, not yet. But if I waited much longer, the wetland spill basin could overflow, and if that happened, the city would investigate me for negligence. That's the part Karen didn't understand. Owning a lake wasn't just power, it was responsibility. And I took that seriously. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer, slipped into my old boots, and walked the muddy trail to the floodgate. The storm whipped the branches above like angry arms, but I was calm, focused. I'd done this before twice after heavy spring runoff, once when the beaver dams backed up and nearly flooded my root cellar. The box was half buried in wet leaves, but the lock popped open with a satisfying click. I reached down, felt the familiar cold iron of the valve crank, and began to turn. One full rotation, then another. The sound was slow at first, like a sigh. Then came the whoosh, like the lake exhaling through clenched teeth. I smiled. Water surged through the underground spillway down the reinforced tunnel Allison and I had once walked together just to feel the echo of our footsteps under the soil. It twisted west, away from the new houses, away from Karen's precious splash zone. Every gallon that passed through was a reminder. This lake has a guardian. And he's not finished. By dawn, the storm had passed, and the lake was 6 inches lower than it had been the night before. From my back porch, I could see the full effect. Karen's inflatable platforms sat crooked in the mud. The family wade zone was now a crater of exposed liner and tangled wires. The floating dock beached. A mess of zip ties, plastic anchors, and exposed rebar now lay where the children's area had been. I didn't smile. Not because I didn't feel satisfaction, but because it was never about revenge. This was about dignity, control, restoring something that had been stolen. By 9:00 a.m., Karen was on site, pacing with a clipboard, rain boots splashed in filth. A contractor stood nearby, shaking his head while gesturing toward the exposed pump lines. The porta potty had tipped during the storm, and now leaned dangerously over a shallow trench like a failed metaphor for the whole operation. She saw me watching from the porch. I lifted my coffee mug in salute. She stormed off. That same morning, I received an envelope from the HOA delivered by courier. I opened it carefully, expecting another fine. It was worse. It was a cease and desist. "Mr. Prescott, you are hereby ordered to cease all actions affecting community infrastructure, including but not limited to alterations to the lake water level landscaping changes that impact HOA access routes or communications to residents, regarding ongoing community projects. Any further disruption will result in formal litigation. Sincerely, Karen Schultz, President, Lakeside Preservation Committee. I laughed. A real from-the-gut laugh that startled even me, because this letter wasn't backed by any law. Karen had run out of authority and was now clinging to threats. But I was ready for this too. I contacted my lawyer Caroline Tran, a friend from my Navy days, who now specialized in property rights. She'd already reviewed my case. When I forwarded her the cease and desist, she called me within the hour. "They're bluffing," she said. "Not only do you have full rights to manage the water, you have legal precedent. And if they try to sue you, they'll be laughed out of court." "Good," I said, because I'm done playing defense. That afternoon, I filed a formal injunction request to halt all HOA activity on my land. Caroline helped me prepare the paperwork, affidavits, permits, engineer reports, everything we'd need. By the next HOA meeting, I wouldn't just be defending myself. I'd be flipping the entire game board. But Karen, ever relentless, tried one last move. The next day, a city code official arrived at my door, again different guy, this time. Younger. Nervous. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "we received a new complaint regarding environmental mismanagement. Something about unsafe draining procedures." I nodded, handed him my laminated copy of the 1998 floodgate permits, along with the inspection log signed by the county hydrologist 2 years ago. He studied the documents, cleared his throat, and said, "This is very thorough." I just sipped my coffee. "Look," he added off the record, "she's made a lot of noise down at City Hall. But between you and me, she's overstepped. We've gotten complaints from her about 7 different properties this month. She's losing credibility." I figured. "If it were me," he said quietly, "I'd keep draining it. I intend to." The next few days unfolded like a slow collapse. Residents began murmuring openly at the mailbox clusters. Some stopped me to ask questions. A couple even apologized outright. One woman, Angela, an architect, who'd just moved in last year, said her kids were heartbroken that the splash zone was closed. But she added, "You were here first. They should have respected that." I nodded. It was never about kids. It was about power. She said, "And you just unplugged it." By Friday, the water level had dropped another 4 inches. Karen tried to rally support by claiming I'd endangered wildlife. Too bad for her, I had already contacted the local conservation group. And I had photos of the turtles, herons, and ducks thriving along the shifting shoreline, undisturbed and even expanding into the new shallow zones. The group issued a public statement. Mr. Prescott's actions are within environmental guidelines and, in fact, may improve wetland health during seasonal fluctuation. We support his stewardship. That one went viral on the neighborhood Facebook page. Karen didn't post anything for 3 days after that. Her silence was louder than all her newsletters. And on the 5th day after the storm, a truck arrived from the county, and with it came an order. Not against me, against the HOA. The truck rolled in just before sunrise, its tires crackling over the gravel like a whisper of justice. I stood at my front window, the curtain drawn just an inch to the side, watching as 2 men in county uniforms climbed down from the cab. They didn't bother knocking. Instead, they headed straight for the splash zone entrance, clipboard in hand, fluorescent vests glowing like a warning flare in the gray dawn. By the time Karen arrived, still in her pink jogging set and visibly flustered, they were already photographing the exposed foundations, the warped floating platforms, and the now widened drainage trench snaking along the lake's edge. The water had dropped another inch overnight, thanks to the gate's steady outflow and the natural runoff from the storm. Karen approached them with that same signature confidence, chin-up voice, sweet with a hint of command. "Good morning, gentlemen. I wasn't expecting an inspection today, but of course I'm happy to assist." One of them, a tall man, with a badge that read Hollis, cut her off politely but firmly. "We're here on an enforcement order issued by the county zoning office and signed by the Environmental Compliance Division. This construction site is being reviewed for multiple potential violations, lack of permitting, disruption of wetland perimeters, and trespass on non-HOA land." She blinked, her smile twitching. There must be a misunderstanding. This project was approved by the HOA board and voted on by residents. Hollis turned a page on his clipboard. "That doesn't override zoning laws, Ms. Schultz. And it certainly doesn't override private property rights." She looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under her. I stepped onto my porch, a thermos of coffee in hand, and nodded toward the crew. Need anything from me, gentlemen? Just your signature here, Mr. Prescott Hollis said. Confirming you're the legal landowner and manager of the floodgate and shoreline. I signed without hesitation. Karen turned toward me flustered. You set this up. You called them. No, I said calmly. The law called them. I just handed it the phone. She stared at me for a moment longer, then spun on her heel and stormed back toward her car. Her sneakers squelched in the mud as she walked past the half-finished splash zone, now a mess of broken pipework, sagging tarps, and mocking silence. Later that afternoon, I received a copy of the official citation. Construction halted immediately pending investigation. All equipment was to be removed within 72 hours, or the HOA would incur daily fines, not me them. But I wasn't done draining the lake. No, not yet. See, I had waited long enough for justice. And while the officials were busy shutting down Karen's dreams of a lakeside amusement park, I was focused on something more symbolic. A complete and legal draining of the entire lake. Not forever. Just long enough to let them see what they'd done. To let them stand in the cracked mud of their arrogance. I opened the gate wide that night. Not recklessly. Not vengefully. Just completely. The current hummed through the channel like a song only I remembered. The water receded at a steady pace, gliding down the slope, pulling with it the sediment, the filth, the broken trust they'd tried to bury. I sat on my bench beneath the dogwood Allison's name, still carved into the wood beside mine, and I watched as the moon cast light over the dwindling basin. Ducks waddled through the shallows. A heron stalked the exposed shoreline, snatching minnows from puddles. By morning, the lake was nearly gone. Not dry, but emptied, hollowed. What remained was raw and honest tree stumps, jutting up like Bones' old fishing lures, caught in roots the detritus of memory and misuse alike laid bare. The shoreline glistened with morning dew, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt clean again. I brewed my coffee as usual, but this time I set up 2 chairs. I wasn't expecting company, it just felt right. Around 9:00 a.m., the texts started arriving. Martha, what happened to the lake? Are you okay? Angela, I walked the trail. Did you drain it? It's haunting. Beautiful. James, we need to talk. Karen's losing her mind. And then, the knock. It wasn't loud, just 2 soft taps. I opened the door and found Martha there holding a box of muffins and looking sheepish. I was wrong, she said before I could speak. I nodded slowly. About all of it, she said. Karen made it seem like you were some bitter old man hoarding a view, but you were right. This was your land, your water, your life, and we helped her take it. I stepped aside, coffee still hot. We sat on the porch eating in silence, staring at the exposed basin that used to shimmer blue. She shook her head. I can't believe she pushed it this far. She's still pushing, I said, but I think the ground just gave out. Later that day, I received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. It was short and panicked. Effective immediately. The Lakeside Splash Zone project is suspended. The HOA offers its sincerest apologies for any unintended infringement upon your property. We request a formal meeting to discuss reparations and possible boundaries to prevent further misunderstandings. It was the first time they'd admitted fault, but they still didn't understand what they'd done. This wasn't about boundaries or fences. This was about memory, about respect, about a man who had buried his heart in the ripples of a quiet lake, only to have someone try and pave over it with plastic tubing and committee votes. The next morning, I held a small gathering at the edge of the drained basin. Nothing formal. Just a few neighbors, a thermos of coffee, and a folding chair for anyone who wanted to sit beside me. I told them about Allison. About the way she used to float quietly, arms stretched like wings. About the time she caught a trout with her bare hands and screamed so loud the birds scattered. About the promise I made at her bedside that I'd protect this place no matter what. And that was the first day anyone cried. Not for the lake, for what it meant, for what had nearly been lost. I wasn't alone anymore. Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. Her name disappeared from the HOA emails. Rumors circulated that she'd been asked to step down pending legal review. James and Angela offered to help rewrite the bylaws. We want to make sure this never happens again, Angela said. No one should be able to override a neighbor's dignity with a vote. I nodded. They were starting to get it. Karen didn't go quietly. Even after the county shut down her project, even after the HOA's legal team began to distance themselves, even after most of the community saw the drained lake with their own eyes and understood the truth, she clung to her story like a sinking ship clings to its last nail. She started with the emails. Dozens of them. Long, rambling, half-panicked screeds sent to every HOA member's inbox under the subject line: an urgent clarification from your president. The so-called draining of the lake was a reckless, selfish act committed in full defiance of community wishes. Mr. Prescott's documents were never fully vetted by proper legal counsel and have not been reviewed by HOA-approved surveyors. I have sacrificed hours, days of my life trying to improve this neighborhood. I have brought in investments, innovation, and opportunity, and now I am being vilified by a man with a wrench and a grudge. The responses weren't what she hoped for. One by one, neighbors began replying to all pushing back. Angela wrote, "Karen, you lied about permits. You lied about the shoreline. Please stop." James added, "I served on the board under the belief we were acting legally. We weren't. That's on you." Martha, in her usual brevity, simply replied, "Enough. We were wrong. Hank was right. Let it go." And still she kept digging. She called for an emergency HOA meeting to restore order. Less than a dozen people showed up. I wasn't among them. Neither were most of the residents from my side of the lake. The few who did attend said she spent 20 minutes pacing back and forth with color-coded graphs of lake depth, historical water levels, and population growth predictions. They said her voice cracked, that she used the phrase mutiny of misinformation multiple times. And then, for the first time in her reign as HOA president, someone stood up and said, "I move to have you removed." It was James. The room reportedly went dead silent. Karen froze, then laughed. A dry, nervous cackle that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You can't vote me out," she snapped. "I built this board." Angela stood up next. "Exactly." The motion passed unanimously. Karen didn't stick around to process it. She grabbed her binder, her thermos, and stormed out, muttering something about ungrateful fools. And he's not done draining yet. She was right. I wasn't. The floodgate was still open. Not all the way, just enough to let the water hover at its new lower level. The fish had adapted. The herons returned. The turtles nested along the quieter banks. Nature, unlike HOA presidents, adjusts with grace. I received an official letter 2 days later from the newly appointed interim HOA board. It was respectful, handwritten, and hand-delivered. "Dear Mr. Prescott, on behalf of the board and many in our community, we offer our sincere apology. What happened was not just a misstep in judgment, it was a failure of respect. You were dismissed, your rights ignored. And the result was pain not just for you but for our neighborhood as a whole. We invite you to speak at our next meeting. No politics, just your story, if you're willing." I took a long time thinking about it. I'd never wanted a stage. Only solitude, peace, space to keep a promise I made to my wife under a sky of rust-colored autumn leaves. But something had shifted. This wasn't about defending the lake anymore. It was about honoring it. I said yes. The night of the meeting, I walked into the same clubhouse where I'd once been, shouted down, fined, dismissed. Now people stood as I entered. They moved chairs, offered water. Martha brought a plate of shortbread cookies that I suspect were store-bought, but the gesture mattered. I stood in front of them, no microphone, no slideshow, no clipboard. Just me. A tired man in a flannel shirt, calloused hands, a worn face, and a truth that had finally outlived the lies. "I came here in '98 with my wife," I began. "Back when this place was more trees than rooftops. We picked the lot because of the lake. It was untouched, pure, unregulated. She used to say it listened more than it spoke. Some people smiled softly. Others lowered their heads. I told them everything. About Allison. About the bench. About the promise I made to never let that lake become anything less than sacred. I'm not against growth," I said. "I'm not against children laughing or community events or splash zones if that's your thing. But not here. Not on sacred land. Not by force. Not without respect." There was silence when I finished. Then applause. Real applause. Not the polite kind you give out of obligation, but something slower, heavier. The sound of people realizing something they should have seen all along. That night, I walked back home by the lake. The moon shimmered on its reduced surface like silver on velvet, and though the water was lower, the heart of it was full. Karen, she moved 2 weeks later. Rumor had it she tried to run for a neighboring HOA position. They found out what happened here, and politely declined. The air felt different after Karen left, like a fever breaking after a long illness, humid with the weight of what had been but breathable at last. The tension that had wrapped around the neighborhood like barbed wire began to ease strand by strand as people slowly stepped out from behind the curtain of HOA fear and into something almost forgotten community. The first thing the interim board did was call for a public review of every action Karen had taken in the last 2 years. The Splash Zone project was just the most visible offense. What they discovered underneath it was worse. Over $24,000 had been spent on consulting fees to contractors who were either friends of hers or shell companies she controlled. Unpermitted construction projects had been greenlit without vote or notification. Homeowners had been fined arbitrarily with no formal review process. Most of those fines had never even been deposited into the official HOA account. They'd gone to a secondary fund labeled Community Innovations. It was theft, plain and simple. A committee of 6 residents, 3 from the lakeside, 3 from the upper hills, compiled a 36-page report. I read it twice. It was damning. By the end of the month, the new board submitted the report to the county prosecutor's office. And then something wild happened. The entire HOA resigned. Every member from the Karen administration, even the ones who tried to quietly fade into the background, stepped down in a mass exodus once the investigation went public. No one wanted to be caught in the collapse. No one wanted their name in the papers or on the neighborhood Facebook page, where screenshots of Karen's emails were now being shared like war stories. Angela, James, and Martha asked me to help form a temporary council. I declined. I told them I didn't fight this so I could sit on a throne. I fought this so no one else would be dragged through it. But I agreed to help rewrite the rules. We met in living rooms, not boardrooms. We ate potluck casseroles and drank iced tea instead of calling roll. We created a lake stewardship agreement outlining clear boundaries, water responsibilities, and wildlife protections. And we added a clause: no structure, project, or initiative may be proposed on privately deeded property without the owner's written and recorded consent, regardless of community vote. It passed unanimously. The HOA, for all intents and purposes, became an advisory group. They held cookouts, organized street cleanups, offered rides to doctor appointments. The obsession with power evaporated. What remained was neighborliness. And the lake, it healed. I kept the water low through the fall, allowing the shoreline to settle and the reeds to return. By spring, with new rains and clean runoff, it filled naturally again. Not to its original depth, but just enough to remind me of Allison's laughter echoing across the water. Neighbors began visiting not to splash or shout, but to sit. Quietly. Sometimes with fishing poles, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing but their thoughts. One afternoon, Raul brought his grandson to learn how to cast a line. The kid tripped in the mud, soaked himself, and burst into tears. Raul just laughed and said, "Now you're part of the lake." I looked out over the water and thought, aren't we all? But not everyone had moved on. A letter arrived in early April. A lawyer's firm in a neighboring town. Karen's. She was suing the HOA, claiming wrongful removal, emotional distress, and defamation. The irony was rich. I wasn't named in the suit, but her lawyer sent a separate notice demanding I cease further water manipulation and cease from public statements that portray Ms. Schultz in a negative light. Caroline, my lawyer, laughed so hard she nearly spilled her coffee. This isn't a case, it's a tantrum in a suit. We filed a motion to dismiss. The HOA countered with documentation of her fraud. The suit crumbled before it ever reached a courtroom. Karen would go quiet after that. I heard she moved in with her sister, that she stopped attending HOA meetings altogether, that she joined a bridge club where she still insisted she'd been ambushed by a conspiracy of bitter men and jealous neighbors. Let her talk. Let her explain away her collapse however she needs. Because down by the lake, we didn't talk about Karen anymore. We talked about turtles hatching in the reeds, about the fish biting in early mornings, about the foxes we spotted near the lower trail, and the blue heron that had returned to nest near the old boat ramp. The splash zone was gone, replaced with tall grass and wildflowers. No signs, no fences, no plastic. One day, a little girl walked down the path with her mother and pointed to the lake. "What happened here?" she asked. Her mother said some grown-ups tried to change it, but the lake didn't want to change. The little girl nodded. "It's better this way." Yes, I thought. It was. I built a new bench that spring. Not to replace the old one, just to add something new beside it. A space for someone else to sit, to listen, to learn. I engraved the wood with a phrase I'd whispered to Allison 1,000 times. Still ours. Still standing. Still sacred. Still mine. But not mine alone. Summer came gently that year. No grand announcement, no blaze of heat, just longer days, softer light, and a breeze that rustled through the trees like a sigh of relief. The lake, still modest in depth, but brimming with life, had settled into a kind of quiet dignity. No fences, no construction, no Karen. For the first time in years, I could sit on my bench with a cup of coffee and hear only the wind, the birds, and the occasional ripple of fish beneath the surface. The scars from the HOA's attempted takeover remained bare patches of earth where they'd poured concrete, a rusted metal post half buried in the shallows, but they no longer felt like wounds. They were reminders, proof that peace once lost could be reclaimed. Neighbors stopped by more often now, not to gawk or gossip, but to share, to ask questions, to listen. I found myself telling stories I hadn't spoken aloud in years. Stories about Allison's stubborn optimism, her love of baking pies she always burned, the way she'd float in the lake with her arms out like she was flying. Sometimes they brought lawn chairs and stayed a while. Sometimes they brought their grief. One man, Tom, whose wife had passed just the year before, sat beside me in silence for nearly an hour before finally saying, "I didn't know how much I needed this." I understood, because it wasn't just about the lake. It was about what the lake had survived and what it now offered. One evening in early June, Angela approached me with a tentative smile and a box in her hands. "We had it made," she said. Inside was a bronze plaque, small but weighty, engraved with, "In memory of Allison Prescott. For love, for peace, for standing your ground. This lake is sacred because someone remembered to protect it." I didn't speak. I couldn't. We installed it the next morning, beneath the dogwood tree. No ceremony, no speeches, just the two of us, a shovel, and a few quiet tears. It felt right. A few days later, I received an official letter from the new HOA board. Not a threat, not a fine. An invitation. "Mr. Prescott, in recognition of your contribution to our community's values, the board would like to formally honor you at the July 4th gathering. We understand if you prefer not to attend, but your presence would mean a great deal to those of us who have learned from this experience. With respect, James Foster, President Interim." I thought about it for a while. Crowds weren't my thing. Neither were speeches. But I also knew that this was different. This wasn't performative. It wasn't about power or image. It was about closure, community, continuation. I said yes. On the 4th of July, they gathered in the field just east of the lake, no longer a construction zone, but a wide open space surrounded by wildflowers and folding chairs. Kids ran barefoot through the grass. Dogs barked. Someone grilled hot dogs on a rusted Weber. It was ordinary and beautiful. James stood up first. He kept it brief. "We tried to change the lake," he said. "What we didn't realize was that the lake didn't need to change. We did." Then he handed me a small, hand-carved wooden paddle, polished smooth and engraved with the date. "You've earned the right to steer us, Hank." I took it with a nod, but no speech. Just a quiet step forward toward the water. They followed. One by one, people walked the new trail that looped the lake, part gravel, part grass, entirely voluntary. There were no signs, no admission, no rules except one etched into a simple wood post. Respect the peace, honor the past, listen to the lake. The fireworks later that night reflected over the water like the sky was trying to apologize for everything that had happened, and maybe it was. The lake shimmered not with chaos or noise, but with color and community. And in that moment, I didn't feel like a defender anymore. I felt like a witness to healing, to justice, to the kind of quiet joy that comes after the storm is gone and the air smells like something new. A few months later, I started a journal. Not a blog, not a memoir, just a spiral notebook and a pen. I called it the Stillwater Ledger. In it, I wrote about the birds that nested near the shallows, the deer that sometimes wandered too close, the fog that curled over the lake like a secret. I left it on the bench for anyone to read, and soon enough other people started adding to it. Notes, poems, sketches. One kid left a drawing of a turtle and wrote, "Mr. Hank's lake is better than a water park." That one made me laugh out loud. And somewhere I think Allison laughed too. Because in the end, I didn't win by fighting harder. I won by refusing to forget what mattered. The HOA tried to take the lake. They tried to silence a memory. But what they didn't understand is that lakes don't belong to boards or bylaws. They belong to those who remember, those who tend, those who sit quietly and listen. And as long as I breathe, I'll be here, listening, watching, protecting, because this lake was always sacred, not because of who owns it, but because of who loved it first and who never stopped.